A young woman falls to her death from a rugged California cliff. Months after she's buried, an investigator suspects she was pushed. Researchers try to determine a woman's cause of death 3,000 years after she died. How can they perform an autopsy without destroying her fragile, mummified shell? To catch a murderer, detectives must prove that a few splinters of bone are the remains of a woman who disappeared 2 years earlier. Time doesn't heal all wounds, a fact that keeps relentless detectives on the trail of cold or forgotten cases. With cutting-edge technology, forensic experts are able to travel back in time, months, years, or millennia, to coax mysteries out of the grave. From San Diego to San Francisco, California's coastal highways are some of the most magnificent drives in the world. Heading north, stretches of glittering sand and crowded freeways gradually give way to a vastly different landscape. As Highway 1 winds through the Monterey Peninsula, mountains collide with the sea in a majestic alliance of power and beauty. In Big Sur, California, the huge sky and boundless Pacific Ocean seduce visitors to the edge of the dizzying cliffs for a breathtaking view of the edge of the world and a snapshot by which to remember it. But sometimes the pull is too strong. On April 2nd, 1987, the Monterey County Sheriff's Department received a phone call that something horrible had happened at the Seal Beach Overlook. The body of a 20-year-old woman named Dina Hubbard Wild was lying near the base of a 600-foot precipice. It was not the first time the search and rescue squad had been dispatched to collect the remains of a victim lured too close to the edge. A deputy from the sheriff's office questioned the middle-aged couple waiting at the scene. They were Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, tourists from San Diego. They told the officer that their young companion had tumbled over silently when they weren't looking. The rescue squad retrieved the lifeless body from the bottom of the cliff. After a cursory examination by the coroner, Dina Wild was returned to her hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, and buried. At the Second Presbyterian Church in Louisville, Dina Wild's freak accident was still on people's minds months after she'd been buried. When services ended one Sunday, Dina's mother, Bobby Roberts, approached a lawyer named Steve Keeney. She needed help collecting insurance money after her daughter's death.
She wanted to collect burial insurance that she had as part of her benefits as a teacher, and the insurance company had told her no. We told her that sometimes a letter from a law firm cuts through the red tape, we'd give it a try.
Keeney knew that Bobby could really use the $3,500. He agreed to make a few phone calls for her on his own time. Keeney called Bobby's insurance company and uncovered the source of the holdup. They had never received Dina's death certificate. Keeney then called the Monterey coroner's office requesting a copy of the death certificate. But when the document arrived, it listed the cause of death as pending. Because Dina's death was presumed to be an accident, the rescue team had done little beyond retrieving the body. No evidence was collected, no photographs were taken. The body was sent to the Monterey coroner's office. Its analysis found no hint of foul play. Bobby Roberts' simple request was snowballing into a time-consuming tangle of bureaucracy. But Keeney pressed on. He contacted Monterey law enforcement only to discover that the case was in limbo. The certificate couldn't be issued until cause of death was determined, but the sheriff's department had, for all intents and purposes, dropped the case for lack of evidence. Dina had been dead for months. What could be holding things up? Keeney called Bobby's insurance company again to see if there was some way of expediting Bobby's payment.
When we called back, we stumbled into a fact that we never expected. That was that there was life insurance on Dina in someone else's name, and they had made a claim for that policy.
The amount that you're looking for is $35,000?
That claimant was none other than Virginia McGinnis, the woman with whom Dina had spent her final hours. Just a day before Dina's death, Virginia had taken a $35,000 policy out on the young woman. The day after Dina's death, she had tried to cash in. In Keeney's mind, Dina's accidental tumble was swiftly transforming into something more sinister. But without a witness or a body, how could he distinguish between a tragic fall and a push?
Ask yourself, how do you prove someone was pushed off a cliff? Imagine you're standing at the edge of the cliff and you fall. Think of the injuries. You'll be battered, there'll be broken bones, there'll be bruises on your body will end up at the foot of the cliff. And now put yourself back at the cliff and imagine you're pushed. Same thing, right? Same bruises, same broken bones. Well, not quite.
The suspicion that Dina may have been shoved over the edge was a chilling hypothesis, but it was still just speculation. To prove any wrongdoing, Keeney needed evidence. He went back to basics, trying to learn more about Dina's relationship with the older couple. Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, the parents of one of Dina's friends, had taken her into their San Diego home after she was separated from her husband. Dina's loneliness was relieved in the fun-filled months she'd spent with her surrogate parents. She was known for her blind devotion to new friends. Had she been duped by the McGinnis's kindness? To check his suspicions, Keeney secured a copy of the autopsy report from the Monterey coroner's office. In the report, he noticed something unusual. A blood test revealed the presence of a drug called amitriptyline, commonly known as Elavil. The antidepressant had never been prescribed to Dina. It had, however, been prescribed to Virginia's husband, B.J. Toxicologist Catherine Ham retested a vial of Dina's blood that had been frozen after her autopsy. Her job was to check for levels of the drug. Keeney hoped that if a crime was committed, it could be proven in the lab.
I think that a lot of people that commit crimes underestimate what we can do in the laboratory.
To test for the presence of chemicals in the blood, Ham adds a solvent into the sample. The tube is rocked for 20 minutes as the drugs move out of the blood and into the solvent. The solvent is then removed from the tube and evaporated. The reconstituted solvent is injected into a gas chromatograph, an instrument that separates compounds according to their chemical properties. Ham compared the standard for the drug and the products of its breakdown with the chromatograph of Dina's blood. They matched. Having been frozen for so long, Dina's blood was degraded. Ham was unable to determine exactly when Dina had taken the drug, or exactly how much she'd taken. What she did know was that Dina Wild had Elavil in her system when she died. With its disorienting and unpleasant side effects, it was hardly the kind of medication that Dina might have popped for a quick buzz. People taking the drug are usually stricken with weakness, nausea, and dizziness. These symptoms would be more pronounced in individuals who, like Dina, didn't take the medication on a regular basis. As he learned about Elavil's effects, Keeney realized that he needed to revise his image of Dina's last moments of life. If she'd been as queasy and unsteady as Ham suggested, she most likely would have slid down the mountain, not plunged. Though no crime scene photos had been taken, the period of time before the fall was well documented. Virginia had sent Dina's mother the roll of snapshots from the day of the accident as a gesture of condolence. Could these posed snapshots tell Keeney about the cause of Dina's death? At first glance, the 15 chronological pictures told the story of an average sightseeing junket. Dina seemed comfortable and happy as she posed for the camera. But as Keeney studied the pictures more carefully, he suspected that he was witnessing a murder plot.
The photograph of Virginia and B.J. McGinnis walking away from the car was taken by Dina Wild, and it is a signature photo. It's at the cliff where she would die a few minutes later. It's when the Elavil has kicked in and she knows something's wrong. She's leaving a note to the rest of us that will survive her. It's like an assault victim who takes their own blood and writes the name of their assailant. She's pointing the finger.
The Elavil had clearly taken effect in the subsequent picture. Dina's bright eyes had grown dull. Her features slackened. She seemed unable to stand on her own.
That's great. 1, 2, 3.
When Keeney got to picture 11, the first thing that came to his mind was Dina knows. What at first seemed an innocuous cliffside stroll revealed upon closer examination the terrifying moment before Dina's death.
At that lip, you can see Dina's shoes pointing toward the boulders, in toward the road, but you can see her head in a blur, turning as she realizes her body is getting pushed that way. And as she looks, like you would if you were pushed, as she looks where she's going, the photo blurs. There are no features of her face at all. But her shoes still point to BJ, the guy she trusted.
Moments later, she would be dead. To Keeney's way of thinking, the bizarre and disturbing circumstances of Dina's death were leading to a single conclusion.
Once you know a 20-year-old dies with 55-year-old strangers at her side, and you know that those strangers bought a life insurance policy on her, in your heart, don't you believe that that's almost bound to be a murder?
Armed only with a handful of photos and a hunch, Keeney was a long way from proving murder. He knew he would need some help. In Louisville, Kentucky, Steve Keeney revisited Dina Wild's autopsy report, looking for a shred of evidence to support his murder hypothesis. The Monterey coroner had determined the cause of Dina's death to be a skull fracture. He surmised that she lost her footing because of her high-heeled shoes. In his opinion, there was nothing suspicious about the circumstances of the so-called accident. Keeney wasn't so sure. He wondered if there was anything in the coroner's slim findings that suggested otherwise. Keeney brought the autopsy photos to forensic pathologist Barbara Weekly Jones. Could her analysis of the pictures differentiate a murder from an accident?
Steve Keeney was surprised when I told him some of the injuries were suggestive of not just an accidental death. Describe any on one hand.
The only fatal injury on Dina's body was a blow to the head, yet the right side of her body had linear scrape marks. To Weekly Jones, those lacerations suggested a limp slide, not a head-first plummet. Dina's bruised hands provided the most telling physical evidence. They hadn't sustained the kinds of injury typical in a fall. Her acrylic nails were snapped off, ragged, and embedded with granite, suggesting she'd clawed at the edge of the cliff, trying to save her life. Or perhaps she'd fought before she plunged to her death. In addition to the torn nails, both hands were marred by a very suspicious wound pattern.
But they had huge hematomas, black and blues, on the tops around her knuckles. Those you get when somebody steps on your hand, if you're holding the edge of a cliff.
Keeney wondered if Dina's broken skull was the result or the cause of her terrible fall. The top of the cliff sloped gently for the first few yards. If Dina had been trying to save herself, she no doubt would have grabbed at a rock or a tree root. But her palms showed no injuries, no signs of clutching at anything.
And look, she had fingernails. It looks like artificial fingernails.
Weekly Jones's findings substantiated Keeney's theory of an intentional push and a limp slide.
No, I don't think so. But that's not proof of homicide. So what else do you do? Well, the old phrase is, circumstances don't lie, people do.
There you go.
Keeney needed to take a close look at the suspects, Virginia and B.J. McGinnis.
Yeah. Well, they come up
Had
and
this
down
pleasant,
from
middle-aged
Mexico
couple
from
really
October
plotted to
to
do away with Dina?
February.
Were they truly capable of pushing their young friend off a 600-foot cliff?
Yeah, they spawn. That's what they do. That's
As he
a good
probed
word
the
for it.
backgrounds of his prime
Spawning.
suspects, Keeney uncovered a trail of death and deception. Virginia's rap sheet was a lot bloodier than Keeney had anticipated. Though the former nurse could affect a saccharine persona, her past suggested a cold, psychopathic profile that included compulsive lying, arson, and cruelty to animals. In addition to the accidental deaths of her daughter and second husband, Virginia's parents and several of her patients had died of unknown causes while in her charge. She frequently benefited from their life insurance policies. Keeney compiled this information into a lengthy report. It wasn't enough evidence to arrest Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, but it was enough to get the case reopened in California. Because the McGinnises had purchased Dina's insurance policy in San Diego, the district attorney's office in that jurisdiction became involved. Investigator Scott Lawrence took the baton from Steve Keeney. Like the Louisville attorney, he was compelled to make sense of Dina's fall. But Dina's case didn't have the benefit of much physical evidence. Lawrence attempted to disprove the theory of an accidental tumble by recreating Dina's trajectory. It was more than a year and a half after Dina's death, so any blood or geographic disturbance from her fall would have been washed away. The only thing Lawrence knew for sure was where she landed. What he needed to determine was where the fall started.
Well, one of the things that we had to look into was where we knew she was last standing at this turnout, almost within a few feet of where I'm at. That's based upon testimonial evidence as well as photographic.
Based on Lawrence's assessment, this wasn't a place where a person was likely to lose her footing, even in high-heeled shoes. The ground was relatively flat and solid. Now, Lawrence could recreate Dina's path down the cliff. Though he was a novice rock climber, his fierce commitment to the truth compelled him down the cliff face with a video camera in hand. From his topographic analysis, Lawrence believed that Dina was dead or near death when she lost her grip on the edge of the overlook. For one thing, the first section of the cliffside was not a sheer drop. Had Dina accidentally fallen here, she probably would have been able to stop her descent. She probably would have screamed. After the initial slope, the cliff drops off suddenly. Lawrence experimented to see how fast and by which route Dina was likely to have descended.
So we could take individual rocks and toss them down, and you get a pretty good idea of how you would accelerate once you got past the incline and once you made that first precipice about 40 or 50 feet down to my right, down toward the ocean.
Had Dina free-fallen off the precipice, she would have hit the bottom in excess of 120 miles per hour. Yet her body was in one piece, with no tumbling marks and relatively few fractures. Lawrence's research corroborated Weekly Jones's analysis of the body. Dina went down the cliff in a slow, limp slide, not an accelerating, high-speed tumble. Lawrence's careful recreation of the fall didn't jibe with the story relayed by the McGinnises.
So we tried in many ways to interpret what could have happened, and the bottom line is there's always unknowns, and the people that know aren't talking.
By September of 1989, police gathered enough incriminating evidence to arrest the McGinnises. For the trial, the cliffside overlook was transformed into an outdoor courtroom. Scott Lawrence's careful recreation had a profound impact on the jury. The odyssey begun in Steve Keeney's office ended when the jury found Virginia McGinnis guilty of conspiracy, first-degree murder, insurance fraud, forgery, and murder for financial gain. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. B.J. McGinnis had died of pneumonia before the trial began. The inconsistencies in the so-called accidental death of Dina Hubbard Wild had been untangled to reveal a cold-blooded murder, despite the fact that neither the body nor the crime scene had been preserved. For experts hoping to solve old murders, keen analysis of the meager traces left behind means the difference between overdue justice and a death that is forever lost in time. For 7 years, Susan Davis endured an unsatisfying marriage with a struggling insurance salesman named Ralph. Leaving was always on her mind, but she never got very far from their Columbia, Missouri home. Then, one evening in June 1985, after a long day at her secretarial job, she climbed into her Ford Escort and drove off, never to be seen again. When she failed to show up for work the next day or answer phone calls, her mother contacted the police. Officers from the Boone County Police Department questioned relatives and searched the Davis home, but found nothing to indicate that Susan had been taken against her will. Some people believed Susan's departure was her way of making a clean break from a life that had gotten too painful and messy. At the time of her disappearance, Susan had finally succeeded in making some big changes. She'd separated from Ralph and sent her 2 children, Robbie and Angela, to live with her parents in Iowa.
And what was his occupation?
Perhaps she was starting her life over in some other part of the country. Captain Larry McCrae led the investigation.
Ralph Davis told us that when Susan disappeared that she had a boyfriend and she'd probably gone off to Texas, and someday she'd show back up.
Susan was officially declared a missing person. In her absence, Ralph moved back into the house, brought his children home from their grandparents, and settled into the life of a single father. The family waited in vain for Susan's return. As his finances dwindled, Ralph went to court to make sure that if Susan did resurface, she'd be compelled to pay him child support. But there were still no clues as to her whereabouts and diminishing hope that she'd ever return. But as McCrae came to realize, Ralph Davis's victimized spouse routine was a feeble charade. The more he probed police files, the more McCrae came to realize what an abusive husband Ralph had been. For the duration of their marriage, Susan had lived in the wake of Ralph's ferocity. Then, one night in 1985, a few months before her disappearance, she'd reached the breaking point. Fearing for her life and the safety of her children, she garnered the strength to call the police. Ralph was arrested.
We investigated a case where Ralph had beat her up. We'd photographed, and at that time, there was an ex parte on her, which says, Ralph, you cannot go back to your home. You have to stay away from Susan and the kids.
A short stay in jail did little to calm Ralph. He had been boiling mad when he was released on bail. Then Susan disappeared. Ralph's violent tendencies gave credence to the theory that Susan had left him and covered her trail to ensure her safety. But for McCrae, the pieces still weren't adding up. Why hadn't this devoted mother contacted her children? Why hadn't she checked in with her frantic mother to let her know that she was all right? McCrae suspected he was looking at something more ominous than a woman in search of a happier life. McCrae believed that Ralph Davis wasn't telling the whole story. But without any evidence, the police had no course of action. There was no body. There were no leads. Even Susan's car had disappeared. McCrae's only option was to dig in and hope that one day a clue would surface. He didn't imagine that the waiting game would play out for so long. It had been 2 years since Susan Davis climbed into her car and vanished. Whether she left town intentionally or met a horrible fate remained an unanswered question. Captain McCrae's investigation met a dead end. Then one day, the owner of a storage facility took the locks off a unit rented by a customer who'd stopped paying his bills. Inside was a Ford Escort with the driver's side window blown in. The name of the delinquent customer was none other than Ralph Davis.
That's McCrae.
Captain McCrae was contacted. A quick run of the vehicle ID and tags confirmed it was Davis's car. McCrae took a look inside and was struck with a terrible sight.
When we approach the car and we look inside of it, we're pretty sure that somebody died in that car.
Blood and tissue spattered the dashboard, seats, and visors. Glass shards mingled with spent bullet shells on the car floor. 2 feeble air fresheners added a grim irony to the grisly scene. After 2 years of sitting on his hands, McCrae could finally move in on his prime suspect, Ralph Davis. Davis came up with a story to explain away the car. Before blowing out of town, he said, Susan had paid him one last visit. She was armed. Ralph overpowered her, pulled her out of the car, and climbed behind the wheel. As he drove away, he claimed, Susan smashed the window with her arm, bloodying the glass. The implausible account did little to explain how bits of body tissue got into the car. Davis was arrested. Experience told McCrae that he'd just detained a brutal murderer, but proving that in court would be another matter, especially when the crime scene was 2 years old. A successful forensic investigation would take a two-pronged approach. First, McCrae's team would have to establish that a murder had in fact taken place in the car, and secondly, they'd have to identify the victim. McCrae believed he was looking at the remains of Susan Davis, but he was a long way from proving it. From the pattern of blood in the car, preliminary crime scene reconstruction determined that the victim had been shot inside the vehicle.
On the floor of the car, we found glass, basically moving inward, which would indicate that a shot or something had gone through that and from the outside. As we looked at the glass, we found that the glass was on the floorboard, and on top of the glass was blood.
It seemed that the shot came through the window, striking the driver in the head. The force sent the victim toward the other side of the car, crashing first into the rearview mirror hard enough to crack the windshield. From the amount of blood and brain tissue found in the car, the medical examiner determined that someone had died here. The automobile was towed to a private storage lot where McCrae's team could try to make sense of the disarray. Because they didn't know what was evidence, they erred on the side of caution and collected everything.
Do you see, is there something back over, see back over?
Armed with specialized tools, apparel, and collection bottles, the investigators began to take the car apart, piece by piece, carefully cataloging each fragment of bone, tissue, and each smear of blood. Bullets were dislodged from the interior of the car. They matched shotgun shells found in Ralph Davis's home. A vacuum with sterile filters was used to collect the tiniest pieces of evidence. Like high-tech car vandals, the team stripped the escort down to the bare bones, bagging everything from the steering wheel to the carpeting for further analysis. At the University of Missouri's Human Skeletal ID Lab, bits of debris, some metal, some glass, some unidentified, were delivered in a matchbox to anthropologist Sam Stout. If human bone fragments were present in the jumbled findings, Stout would know how to unlock their secrets.
My work as an anthropologist was probably important in this case because as anthropologists we're often called upon to analyze bone specimens. We're probably the most familiar with pieces of bone, fragments of bone, whether it be a 2 million year old fossil to a modern cemetery.
33 fragments, none longer than a quarter inch, were separated into little plastic caps.
Bone specimens to embed in plastic and then we'll,
Because the findings were so small, it was nearly impossible to determine by sight whether they were bone. To be sure, Stout needed to examine the samples under a microscope. First, they needed to be prepared for viewing. To make slides, Stout's assistant embeds each fragment in plastic. As the air in the vacuum chamber is drawn away, the plastic impregnates the sample, then hardens. The embedded specimen is cut into slices as thin as cellophane. Each slice is then smoothed and placed on a glass slide for viewing. Microscopic analysis of the cross-sections told Stout that he was, in fact, looking at human bone. Stout knew where the fragments came from, a human skull. Dr. Stout had determined that the meager scrapings from the floor of Susan Davis's car were in fact human facial bones. Now he wanted to see if there was anything unique about the bone fragments that could tie them to Susan Davis and her death. Stout noticed that there were some smudges on the bone fragments. He sent them to the geology department at the University of Missouri lab. A scanning electron microscope revealed that traces of lead had been embedded in the bone. The presence of antimony indicated that gunpowder was involved as well. This victim had been shot. The close scrutiny of these fragments was turning the cloudy details into a vivid portrait of murder. But how could Stout link the bone to Susan Davis? Stout noticed an odd characteristic. Beyond the lead smudges was another lighter discoloration in the bone. In Stout's experience, that pattern indicated that the victim had been taking tetracycline. To test for the antibiotic, he exposed the bone to fluorescent light. If the drug were present, the bone would glow.
We saw the actual fluorescing of tetracycline, and upon seeing that, I suggested that they examine the records to see if Susan Davis had a prescription for tetracycline.
Dr. Stout estimated that the victim had been taking the drug for at least 3 months before death. McCrae knew from the original search of Susan's home that she'd been prescribed tetracycline at the time of her death. Stout had shown that the remains in the car were from the face of a person who was taking tetracycline. But McCrae needed irrefutable proof that this was Susan Davis. Without it, Ralph Davis would likely go free.
The missing link was, whose body was it? We all felt that it was Susan, but that's not evidence that you can take to court.
No murderer in the state of Missouri had ever been convicted without a body, so McCrae had a double burden. Before he could prove that Ralph Davis was a killer, he'd have to prove that Susan Davis was the victim. The finishing touches of the investigation would have to be drawn in blood. Could bloodstains link a 2-year-old crime scene to the death of Susan Davis? It was forensic serologist Lori Maloney's job to find out. Carpeting, sun visors, and upholstery from the interior of the car were sent to her at the Missouri State Highway Patrol lab. If she could determine that blood on these items came from Susan Davis, it would be nearly impossible for Ralph Davis to evade prosecution. But, as Maloney knew, irrefutable victim identification is tricky business. She needed to run a series of tests to find out exactly whose blood this was. Above all, she needed to be precise, to check and cross-check her results. Maloney's first task was to swab the samples to make sure that the stains found in the car were truly blood. The test turns green when blood is present. Maloney then needed to confirm that the blood was human. She added human antibody to the samples. When human blood and human antibody come in contact, they react, forming a thin white line. Maloney's results were consistent with McCrae's theory that someone had been killed in the vehicle.
I found on the evidence human blood detected on the carpeting and the seat belt latches. Also, I found human protein on the sun visors.
But how could she prove that the remains had come from Susan Davis? She had no samples of Susan's blood or tissue to compare them with. Paternity tests are commonly used to establish a man's parenthood by comparing his DNA with that of the child and its mother. By applying that standard procedure in a creative new way, a reverse paternity test, Maloney hoped to simulate Susan Davis's genetic profile. Every child gets half his DNA from his mother, half from his father. Subtracting DNA bands that the father and child have in common leaves a barcode representing the mother's genetic signature.
The remaining bands would then be used to compare to the crime scene evidence, and if those were matching to the crime scene evidence, the blood could have originated from the mother, Susan Davis.
Using this procedure, Ralph Davis's DNA pattern was subtracted from his children's. The resulting bands were a close simulation of Susan Davis's genetic fingerprint. This banding pattern matched the samples found on the Ford Escort's carpet. Susan Davis had been killed in her car. The ghostly fingerprint of a woman who'd vanished years earlier was returning to solve her murder.
What I think happened to Susan Davis was that she was going to leave this area to some safe haven because of Ralph's harassing her, stalking, and she was packing her car, backed up to the front of the house, loading her clothes in it when Ralph came around the house. She saw Ralph, got in the car, locked it up, and Ralph came up and shot her through the driver's side window.
Thanks to astute forensic analysis and an exacting recreation of the grisly death scene, prosecutors convinced the jury that Ralph Davis had killed his estranged wife in her car. It was a landmark decision in Missouri, one that saw Ralph Davis get the death penalty, even though the whereabouts of his victim is a mystery to this day. In the Susan Davis case, investigators had to revisit a crime that happened 2 years earlier without the benefit of a body. In Canada, investigators faced a similar but even stranger challenge: to determine what killed a woman 3,000 years ago. They had the body, but to touch it would be to destroy it. At the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, a mummy named Jedame-Sank, or Jed, has stood in silent vigil for decades. Her secrets wrapped tightly inside her delicate sarcophagus. Museum visitors and scientists alike are fascinated by her mysterious beauty and eager to know more about how she lived and died. From the elaborate drawings on her cartonnage, the shell of linen and glue in which her mummy is encased, we know only scattered details of her life. Nearly 3,000 years ago, Jed, a musician at the Temple Amun-Re, lived a prosperous life on the east bank of the Nile.
So that she will not want.
Ancient Egyptians celebrated life after death, but it could only be attained if they departed this world in the prescribed fashion. The journey to the land of the gods would be strenuous and dangerous. In order for the soul to survive the trip, the body needed to be strong. Mummification was the answer. A marriage of science and religion, the mummification process followed a strictly detailed procedure that took approximately 10 weeks to complete. After death, the body was cleansed and anointed. A single slit was made in the abdomen. Then the internal organs were removed and preserved in jars. Natron, a powdery drying agent made up of salt and sand, was heaped over the body. In the arid heat of the Egyptian sun, the body would completely desiccate in 40 days. The skin was rubbed with oils and resin to keep it supple. Linen stuffing was inserted in the body cavities to maintain lifelike contours. The corpse was adorned with makeup and funerary jewelry. Then the arduous task of wrapping began. In an effort to know more about these ancient people, many researchers, like pediatrician Peter Lewin, have found themselves compelled to unwrap the mysterious packages.
In the olden days, we would break up this casket, tear off the bandages of the individual inside who's mummified, break up the tissues to examine genetic material, chemistry, and any diseases, and in essence destroy a mummy, which is invaluable to humanity.
Lewin grew up in Egypt and has maintained a lifelong fascination with mummies. Today, in addition to his work at Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children, he is a leading researcher in the field of paleopathology.
Paleopathology is really the study of diseases of ancient man, and that can be done by examining the bodies themselves, and also can be done by the latest use of X-ray technology.
How could Dr. Lewin see into the life of this mummy and learn why she died without desecrating the sanctity of her death? X-ray technology, known as computerized axial tomography, or CT scanning, was the answer to Lewin's dilemma. The machine produces cross-sectional images of the body without touching it. When the slices are stacked together, a three-dimensional image is rendered. Dr. Lewin was assisted by CT technician Stephanie Holoka. Lewin, who pioneered the use of the technique to slice into mummies without using a knife, first scanned Jed in 1978. But the technology was in its infancy, and he was barely able to distinguish the ancient body from the dense packing material. Nearly 20 years later, he was ready to try again. Because the patient was already dead, Holoka didn't need to worry about radiation levels. That freedom enabled her to take numerous pictures at very small increments. She scanned the body in 5mm slices and went to 3mm increments for the head and neck. Even greater detail was used to image the ears and eyes. 300 two-dimensional images were taken during the 4 hours of scanning. Glimpses of Jed came through in these X-rays, but it wouldn't be until they were stacked together that the ancient woman would truly come to life. Once the meticulous scanning was completed, it was finally time for the mummy to show herself. A computer compiled the pictures into a 3D rendering, but the quality was poor. In living patients, bone is dense and shows up white. Fat, flesh, and skin are gray. Liquid is black. In Jed's body, the bones had lost minerals and become softer, while the soft tissue had toughened. Instead of a high-contrast image, Jed was showing up only in shades of gray. This low-contrast problem meant that Holoka would have to painstakingly render the images slice by slice. Imaging the skull in a live patient takes 10 minutes. It took Holoka 3 hours to reconstruct Jed's skull and hundreds of hours to render the entire body. Holoka was then able to electronically peel away the layers. After removing the outermost layer of cartilage, she arrived at the linen wrapping that surrounded the head. Gray circles showed up over the eye sockets. The Egyptians inserted plates behind the lids to keep the features from sinking. Holoka also noticed that in keeping with the ritual, Jed's brain had been removed and her skull stuffed with linen. Finally, the image of a small, young woman appeared. Based on the pattern of bone fusion, Jed was estimated to be 30 to 35 years old when she died.
And the first thing I thought when I saw her skull, after doing a lot of 3D imaging on various skulls, is that she must have been a very pretty lady. She had very high cheekbones and she had a very well-defined chin.
Holoka had used CT technology to excavate the mummy. Now, Lewin wanted to know what killed her. Could he determine cause of death 3,000 years after the fact? Lewin examined the 3D image of Jed's skull. He noticed a strange black shape on the left jawbone. The gaping hole, he realized, was an enormous abscess. Hard as it is to believe, Jed had died from dental disease. Ancient Egyptians were prone to dental disease because of their sandy, coarse diet and their love for sweets. In Jed's case, the outer enamel on 24 of her 28 teeth had worn away, exposing the sensitive dental pulp and the root. Exposed roots are acutely painful. They also become infected easily. Jed's infection was spread from the root canal to the bone, where it caused several abscesses. Lewin surmised that the large pus-filled cyst probably burst, spreading infection throughout her body and poisoning her blood. It was probably an agonizingly painful, drawn-out death.
She probably died a very, very miserable death due to general infection, which originated from this basically dental abscess of her left upper jaw.
In life, this beautiful musician from Thebes endured agonizing pain. In death, thanks to the pioneering efforts of Dr. Lewin's team, she has finally achieved the kind of celebrated and dignified afterlife her culture held so dearly.
With this type of imaging, really, we have pioneered the use of that sort of technology which is non-destructive and which gives us tremendous information in relation to diseases of ancient man.
Because Jedame had been so carefully preserved, time didn't stand in the way of science. Detectives who lure truth from the murky past are constantly fighting against the ravages of time. Today, science is their greatest ally in that battle. Armed with the latest techniques, forensics experts are winning the war against time, liberating lost and forgotten voices from beyond the grave. In Los Angeles, a serial killer eludes police for months. The Night Stalker strikes at random, kills at will. The terror he inspires is enormous. The clues he leaves are slight. But ultimately, they're all detectives have to track him down. Investigators at the scene of a strangling rely on an experimental technique to raise invisible clues. They have only one chance to get it right. If they fail, a killer will walk. Crime scenes can be misleading. They can hold plenty of secrets or next to nothing. Harvesting hidden clues is the first strike against the criminal. To catch him, detectives need to turn fleeting prints into lasting impressions. Despite their working familiarity with death, Los Angeles homicide investigators were chilled by the scene they encountered in the affluent community of Whittier on March 29, 1985. The ransacked condition of the house spoke of robbery as the primary motive. A VCR, video camera, and much of the couple's jewelry was taken. But the perpetrator also had a taste for blood. Vincent Zazzara had been killed by a .22 caliber bullet. His wife, Maxine, was shot in the head and mutilated. The forensics team went to work, but wouldn't find many clues. Though the killer had plundered the home with reckless abandon, he had taken care to protect his identity. Technicians dusting for fingerprints determined that the intruder had worn gloves. Whoever had committed these murders left few traces behind. The bullet slugs were too damaged to be of use. After hours of scouring the home for clues, detectives came up empty-handed. The killer, it appeared, had gotten away clean. But he hadn't covered all his tracks. Beneath an open window, detectives located his point of entry. Distinct footprints marked the soil. One of the two prints belonged to the homeowner, Vincent Zazzara. The other appeared to be the footwork of his killer. Technicians sprayed the print with a fixative, then poured plaster into the indentation. The shoe print was lifted from the ground and sent for analysis. At the sheriff's crime lab, criminalist Gerald Burke examined it.
I was asked to check pattern details, size, take measurements of the casts of the impressions, and to see what kind of information I could get from those shoe impressions with regard to manufacturer, make of the shoe, size of the shoe, things of that nature.
The more Burke could learn about the shoes, the better idea detectives would have about the man who filled them. Burke knew the cast was from an extremely large sneaker, but he couldn't determine what brand of shoe it was. In his years of experience, Burke had never come across a print like this. It wasn't in their reference library of tread patterns. He couldn't find it in shoe stores. It had to be a newly released model or an off-market brand. Either way, the print, like the spent bullets, led detectives to a dead end.
Well, I don't know, they're still pretty young.
Without a source of comparison, Burke's analysis couldn't move the investigation forward. The Zazzara murders weren't the only case that had the sheriff's office puzzled. At the same time, detectives were trying to make sense of a homicide that had occurred less than 2 weeks before, 5 miles away in Rosemead in LA County.
Go, Frank. There's a shot here.
Maria Hernandez arrived home late one night and came face to face with the barrel of a .22. Inside the condominium, her roommate, Dale Okazaki, heard the gunshot. She died almost instantly.
Can you tell me what happened?
Maria Hernandez had been lucky. The keys in her hand deflected the bullet. She played dead until the attacker left.
And the gun was right in my face.
She told investigators that the killer was a thin Hispanic man in his 20s, dressed all in black.
And I laid there. I just knew that I just needed to lay there.
He had black, bulging eyes, hollow cheeks, and rotting teeth. Hernandez had no idea why he wanted her and her roommate dead.
How tall? Is he as tall as I am? Tall?
For a week, the case went nowhere. And then, in an equally random way, the Zazzaras were killed. The .22 caliber slugs from both crimes were sent to the ballistics lab for comparison. They were too distorted to positively link them to the same gun. Even so, Detective Gil Carrillo of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office drew a connection between the homicides.
We had Maria Hernandez, who's surviving victim in the Hernandez case. You have her giving us a physical description and a drawing of an individual that assaulted her. We have a particular caliber gun. In the Zazzara case, we have no physical description, but we have a shoe print. And we have the same caliber gun.
Not only did he see the two crimes as being connected, Carrillo believed they were part of a much bigger pattern. For weeks, violence had been on the rise in Los Angeles County, a 4,000 square mile area of 88 cities. Night after night throughout the county, the toll of murders, sexual assaults, and abductions grew. The media was in a frenzy, reporting crime after crime. And with each episode, the public's fear swelled. The crime lab worked overtime to process the evidence gathered at the scenes. They weren't coming up with much. Carrillo looked for a common thread in the spree of violence. Based on crime reports and conversations with witnesses, he forged a radical theory. His colleagues saw the crimes as LA's growing trend of violence. While they assumed that the crimes had several perpetrators, Carrillo believed they were all the work of a single man. But Carrillo was new to the homicide department. None of his colleagues bought his theory. Apart from the grotesque violence of the crimes, there was no common denominator to suggest they were committed by one man. The rookie's instinct defied conventional wisdom. The sheriff's department wouldn't entertain the idea of a serial killer until Carrillo could base his suspicion on fact.
And until you had enough physical evidence or conclusive evidence, it's difficult to sell everybody that one man was committing all the crimes that had been committed up until that time.
Before he could prove his theory, Carrillo needed a more definitive pattern to emerge. He wouldn't have to wait long. In the weeks following the Zazzara murders, 7 victims throughout Los Angeles County were wakened in their beds. Women were bound with handcuffs, thumb cuffs, or electrical cords before being sexually assaulted. Houses were turned upside down, valuables stolen. Suburban bedrooms were now the most dangerous place in Los Angeles, and everyone was sleeping lightly. In early June, just 3 blocks from the Zazzara's house, a deputy's wife was roused from her sleep. She thought she heard a window opening. Someone was in the house. Hearing the couple's movement, the prowler slipped away. The deputy called the sheriff's department. In the daylight, investigators found gouge marks where the prowler broke in. The deputy pointed investigators to the flower bed, where he'd covered some evidence with a shoebox. Beneath it was the imprint of a large athletic shoe. The waffle pattern was familiar. It looked just like the tread found outside the Zazzara's house. It was the break detectives had been waiting for. If this print matched the print found at the Zazzara murders, it would support Carrillo's theory that one man was stalking LA's neighborhoods. But if that were true, it meant that one lone killer had managed for 1 year to defy LA's best and brightest. Now that he had a basis for comparison, criminalist Gerald Burke examined the 2 plaster casts taken from the crime scenes. He determined the prints were made by shoes of the same model, but not necessarily by the exact same shoe. Because both prints were left in coarse dirt, Burke was unable to identify the subtle marks that make each shoe unique.
Things like little nicks and cuts and scratches, or something that can be used as an identification, more or less like a fingerprint in one shoe sole to another.
This was of little help to detectives. In a county of 7.5 million people, they could not track a man solely by his tread marks. But it was all they had to go on. And it kept showing up again and again. Since the Zazzara murders, the large waffle pattern was found in the mud outside a Monterey Park homicide and was stamped in blood inside the home of a severely beaten old woman in Monrovia. Burke had 3 casts and 1 shoe print to work with. The crimes remained unsolved. The shoe prints remained a mystery. Then, a summer intern casually walking by a lab table made a pivotal observation.
She said, "Oh, that's an Avia." And everybody just stopped and looked at her and said, "Are you sure?" And he said, "Yeah, I got a pair in my trunk." So she goes to the trunk of her car and pulls out this pair of Avia shoes, and that's when everything broke loose.
Avia was a new brand, explaining why the department had no information on them. In order to learn everything they could about this shoe, investigators went to Avia headquarters in Portland, Oregon. The company's designer identified the model number of the shoe that made the print. Burke pressed for more information.
I asked him to be a little bit more specific, and he said that he actually designed that shoe, and that he had a patent on that particular shoe sole design, and that there were no other patterns that were close.
The pattern was from an aerobic shoe that had only been on the market for 4 months. Only 1,300 pairs had been manufactured. Avia provided Burke with a number of soles from the factory so that he could accurately determine the size of the shoe that left the print. The rate of motion and the texture of the ground can greatly distort the impression. The only way to size the shoe was to compare tread patterns. The pattern details on the sole increase as the shoe size increases.
Down here in the bottom of the shoe, actually the mid portion of the shoe, you'll see that there are a number of chevrons. And these chevrons actually increase in number with the increasing shoe size. And the plaster casts, although they weren't good enough quality to record the Avia logo, they were good enough quality to allow me to count these pattern elements, these pattern details.
After counting the lines on the plaster casts, Burke was able to identify every cast he had as coming from a size 11.5 shoe. When he examined the marketing material from the manufacturer, he realized what a crucial discovery he'd made. Of the 1,300 pairs of this model manufactured, only 6 had been shipped to Los Angeles. Of those 6, only 1 was an 11.5. Only a handful of men in the country owned size 11.5 Avias. Carrillo's improbable theory of a single killer was now glaringly real.
When you start throwing the odds of more than one person wearing that particular model and size of shoe, it becomes, it narrows it down quite a bit that not more than one person is committing the crimes. When you have physical descriptions coupled with physical shoe prints, you've got I mean, that's a neon sign saying, come get me. That's one man.
One very dangerous man that required county-wide attention. And getting him wouldn't be easy. They didn't know who he was, but terror had a name. The media dubbed him the Night Stalker. The Sheriff's Department organized a task force of homicide detectives. Carrillo teamed up with Frank Salerno. From his experience hunting some of LA's most deadly serial killers, Salerno knew what kind of challenges they faced.
It's very frustrating. You know, there's one individual out there that's committing all these crimes, and very violent, serious crimes, and you want to bring it to an end as quickly as you can.
The task force started small, then swelled as evidence accumulated.
At one point, we had about 75 investigators working in the bureau at that time, and we were using 1/3 of them just to investigate the Night Stalker series.
The Night Stalker held Los Angeles in a reign of terror during the summer of 1985. Night after night, people were struck down in the place they used to feel safest, their own homes. Pressure to solve the case was tremendous. But until detectives like Gil Carrillo uncovered the Night Stalker's identity, they couldn't calm the panic.
Gun sales went up, burglar alarm systems went up. Everybody was locking their windows and doors during a very, very warm summer. And you're talking about something that just took over the entire county of Los Angeles.
Law enforcement took to the streets. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods where the Night Stalker had struck, hoping that someone recognized him. They found nothing but petrified residents, and they knew better than to go at night. After dark, people weren't opening their doors to anyone. Sergeant John Yarborough was responsible for collecting evidence connected to the crimes.
In one house, I found a couple who had abandoned sleeping in their bed. They'd created dummies in the bed. The husband was sleeping routinely in the garage, and the wife was sleeping behind a television with the portable telephone. I mean, that was the kind of fear and panic that developed over this case.
Whether he killed his victims or let them live seemed as random as the rest of his behavior. Those who survived his attacks described as Maria Hernandez had, a tall man with bulging eyes. He was saturated in a rank, leathery odor.
How about the mouth?
With the help of an identikit, a staff artist created a likeness of the man who had attacked them.
Did he have a mustache, any facial hair?
Good. So good to you? Yeah, looks good. I think that's him. I think that's it.
Detectives knew what he looked like, but he thwarted every effort to find him. The Night Stalker's unpredictability made his next move impossible to anticipate. Most serial killers conform to a regimented routine. This one seemed to work at random. He hit neighborhoods all over Los Angeles. His victims, both men and women, varied in age, ethnicity, and economic background. His MO was all over the map.
What we had was a man that sometimes used a gun, sometimes used a knife, sometimes used blunt force trauma, some he raped, some he didn't, some he strangled, some he just stomped to death, some he robbed, some he didn't.
The only thing he never changed was his shoes.
I'll tell you what, I'll lock down some things.
To track the Night Stalker, Gerald Burke had to become an expert in the killer's footwear. He was dispatched to any crime scene that seemed remotely linked to him.
Okay, that sounds good.
I was out at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning on one side of the county, and at 6 o'clock in the morning I would be called to another side of the county, and I was just all over the place.
And though detectives could track the killer by his shoe prints, they always lagged one step behind him. On July 5th, they followed his tracks to the posh community of Sierra Madre.
Dad!
That morning, 16-year-old Whitney Bennett woke up backwards in bed. She had a searing headache. While the Bennett family slept just feet away, the girl had been beaten near death with a tire iron. She remembered nothing about the attack, but the familiar calling card was there. Sergeant John Yarborough speculated that the killer had two reasons for wearing the same shoes over and over again. First, they were functional. They allowed him to move surreptitiously or run if he needed to. Secondly, they'd never let him down.
But psychologically, it may have been the good luck shoes. He always wore them. They were always successful. He was always able to do what he wanted to do when he was wearing these shoes, so they had a good feeling for him.
The brutality of the crimes advertised the killer's lack of remorse and his delight in causing death.
I would say that he's a very good example of the predator-type offender who clearly just does not care about the victims that he comes in contact with. And he achieves a degree of thrill from it. That motivates him. Now, is he intelligent and cunning and clever? Well, he was certainly clever enough.
The Night Stalker was crazy like a fox and just as hard to corner. The task force wasn't enough. If detectives were going to capture this serial killer, they needed to spread out. Investigators made a videotape for LA County's 63 police departments. On the tape, Carrillo detailed the evidence gathered from the crime scenes. The suspect was a young Hispanic male who always wore Avias. An expert cat burglar, it was impossible to tell if his primary motive was killing or robbery. As the body count grew, a few patterns emerged. He seemed to target yellow or beige houses. He sometimes drew pentagrams at the crime scene. But this information brought detectives no closer to identifying the horrible face that haunted Southern California. The violence reached a frenzy as the summer of 1985 wore on. By early August, the Night Stalker was suspected of killing 13 people and attacking 10 others. His activity in and around Los Angeles seemed to be accelerating. Law enforcement braced for his next assault. And then, nothing. For the first time in months, nights were passing peacefully. But not for long. On August 18th, the Night Stalker struck again, this time in San Francisco. Peter and Barbara Pan, a couple who lived in a yellow house, were found murdered. It was the typical pattern: forced entry in the middle of the night, brutal murders, pentagrams, and stolen valuables. The unpredictable Night Stalker had just expanded his territory by 380 miles. The entire state was now under his grip. Where he'd strike next, no one could predict. San Francisco Mayor Dianne Feinstein called a press conference to calm the citywide hysteria. But she divulged sensitive forensic information detailing the sneakers and the ballistics findings. Detectives believed the Night Stalker was following his case in the media. All along, he had enjoyed toying with law enforcement. Now that he knew exactly what they had on him, the advantage was his. He was likely to change his MO, and he was sure to discard his signature footwear. But a few good things came out of the media hype. San Francisco newspapers publicized the items of jewelry stolen from the Pans. A $10,000 bounty was placed on the Night Stalker's head. informants started coming out of the woodwork. An informant, Donna Myers, told police that a man named Rick from El Paso had given her a bracelet and some rings.
He was very tall.
Like the description of the Night Stalker, Rick had terrible teeth, smelled bad, and was always spouting off about the virtues of
He was
Satan.
about my length, very full.
Police learned his last name was Ramirez.
Very dark brown to black.
Police now knew who he was, but they still had to find him. The Los Angeles phone book was full of men named Richard Ramirez. A fingerprint lifted from a stolen car at a crime scene pointed the finger of blame at a single suspect.
When Ramirez's name came up, they pulled all the Ramirez's that had been arrested, which there were numerous of them, Richard Ramirez's, and they physically checked it just like you would by eye and made that identification.
Once they determined which Ramirez they were after, surveillance personnel were deployed all over Los Angeles. They concentrated on places Ramirez was known to frequent. One of those places was the bus depot. Uniformed officers and undercover cops swarmed the station. But since they were looking for a man attempting to leave LA, they didn't pay attention to arriving passengers. Ramirez, returning from Tucson, spotted the undercover officers before they saw him. He slipped out of the bus terminal and went to an East LA bodega for some breakfast. He quickly realized that he was the center of attention. El Matador, they whispered, the killer. Police were called. The chase was on. Ramirez ran for his life along the 5 freeway.
He ran like a gazelle. He literally ran at a full sprint, probably a good 2-3 miles. Kept going, went over 10-foot sound walls, crossed 8 lanes of the 5 freeway right here.
The fugitive made his way into a residential neighborhood of East LA. He saw his only way out, but it wouldn't take him far. Police interceded. The man they protected from attack was the man they'd been hunting for months. Their prime suspect, Richard Ramirez. At the police station, all eyes moved toward his shoes. They weren't Avia's. The Night Stalker was too clever to wear those again. But they were size 11.5. It seemed they had their man, but they didn't have his shoes. As always, it appeared the Night Stalker remained one step ahead of them.
Pinky, let's see your pinky.
Both Carrillo and his partner Frank Salerno believed that Richard Ramirez was the Night Stalker, but they didn't have the notorious sneakers. To build their case, the detectives would need to carefully draw together the web of evidence. Their first task was to interview the suspect. His demeanor surprised them.
Very soft-spoken. For lack of a lot of education, he was well-spoken also. Probably the thing that sticks in my mind the most is when you walk into an interview room with a suspected killer, is you usually introduce yourself, you tell them who you are. And they walked in and sat down, he says, "You're Frank Salerno."
Ramirez knew of him from the Hillside Strangler case, involving a pair of high-profile serial killers Salerno helped nab 6 years earlier. Detectives learned that their suspect had a vast working knowledge of serial killers throughout history. He knew all of their names, their methods, and the details of their captures. He had followed the Night Stalker case in the media. Though he never admitted to any crimes, Ramirez engaged detectives in a conversation about LA's latest serial killer.
He would talk to us in the third person. I didn't do this, but the Night Stalker might have done this. And the Night Stalker might have done this, and what do you think he'd have done over here?
Ramirez never confessed, so investigators looked for hard evidence to tie Ramirez to the crime spree. Inside his wallet, they had found a claim ticket for a piece of luggage at the bus station. Everything was removed and photographed. The bag contained a revolver and several kinds of ammunition, including .22 caliber cartridges. The evidence was bagged for further analysis. The shells and slugs collected from various crime scenes were taken to the ballistics lab to compare against those taken from the bag. They matched. Also, Ramirez's fingerprints were found on some of the items, confirming that the bag and its contents belonged to him. Most of the Night Stalker's surviving victims picked him out of a lineup. The eyewitness accounts, ballistics, fingerprint, and shoe print evidence provided police with enough to arrest Ramirez for the Night Stalker crimes. 3 years after the arrest, the case finally went to trial. By this time, police suspected that he had killed 16 people and assaulted 11 others. The suspect made no show of repentance. During a preliminary hearing, he sported a pentagram on the palm of his hand. He waved it about, shouting, "Hail Satan." Though no size 11.5 Avia aerobic sneakers were recovered among Ramirez's belongings, it was the prints found in 8 of the crime scenes that held the case together. They formed an irrefutable physical link between the string of burglaries, rapes, and murders. Eyewitness testimony tied the man in court to other crimes, even when no print was present. The most expensive trial Los Angeles had yet seen came to a close after more than a year with a victory for the prosecution. In November 1989, Ramirez was sentenced to death 19 times. Richard Ramirez was one of the most horrifying monsters to terrorize the country. But whether a killer takes many lives or only one, the motivation to kill remains the same. Murder is the ultimate selfish act. On September 2nd, 1990, in Des Moines, Iowa, William Helm and his brother stopped by the home of his estranged wife to pick up some tools. The house was locked. There was no sign of his wife. He could see their son playing unsupervised. He became alarmed.
Susan? Susan? Susan?
Then he found her in the bedroom. Helm called the police. Officers arrived to find a woman's nude body lying in bed. A blanket was pulled up to her chin. Susan Helm, a 24-year-old housewife, was last seen alive at 2 a.m. when neighbors picked up a child she'd been babysitting. The same clothes she'd been wearing the previous night were crumpled on the bedroom floor.
What time did you guys get here?
Police asked William Helm about his relationship with his wife. He told them they were separated and he had moved out. He said he had last seen her the day before when he dropped off their son. They learned through interviews with the couple's friends that there had been a history of domestic violence. A police report stated that William had assaulted Susan 9 months earlier. Nothing in the house seemed out of place. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of burglary. Captain James Trotter of the Des Moines Police Department led the investigation.
We have a routine that we go through on all crime scenes, particularly indoor crime scenes, and we start from the outside and work towards the center to preserve as much of the evidence and photograph it as we possibly can.
The forensics team methodically combed the house in search of the smallest clue as to what took place. Though the victim was nude, they found no evidence of sexual assault. Technicians couldn't find hair, fingerprints, or blood samples to link the killer to his crime. The ligature mark around her neck told of a brutal death by strangulation. Detectives formed some theories. Because of the way in which the body had been covered, they believed that the victim had been killed by someone she knew. Someone who cared enough to conceal her nudity from strangers.
Usually what happens is that after the crime has been committed, then they think, oh my God, somebody's going to see my wife or girlfriend or cousin or whatever the circumstance is, and they'll cover them up. So it's a good clue, simply that. It's just a clue to lead us in a direction in our investigation.
As the bedding was examined, they uncovered another clue. Beneath the blanket, the body had been placed on top of a sheet, and on that sheet was an oily mark that looked like a shoe print.
I think you might have some imprints on the carpet. That's why I want you to be
The
careful
print
with
wasn't
that.
distinct enough to
It
be
is
used for
there the time
comparison,
being.
but it suggested
Show
that the
you
body
something
had been
else.
moved.
Walk up alongside of the bed if you could. Pull that sheet back just a tad.
And so we concluded from that that more than likely someone stood on the bed and maybe pulled or lifted the body onto the bed.
Samples of the blood. Okay.
The oily shoe print was made by automotive grease, embedded with small metal fragments. William Helm welded mufflers for a living. Though the print made him the prime suspect, it would be difficult to build a case against him. The physical evidence, it seemed, would only prove something he'd already admitted, that he'd entered the home, gone into the bedroom, and found the body.
I was going to pick up my daughter, so I pulled up.
Helm was brought to the police station to make an official statement.
Walked up the walk.
Investigators tried to pin him down about any physical contact he may have had with the victim's body when he found her.
I knocked on the door and then there was no
Helm
answer.
claimed that he hadn't moved the bedding at all. He'd only used his fingertips to check her pulse at the wrist and neck.
And then
And so it was critical that we have some physical evidence, otherwise we were only going to have a circumstantial case and probably not anything that we could arrest anybody for.
Detectives hoped that the body would disclose the secrets that the rest of the house had been hiding. More than a shooting or stabbing, strangulation requires close contact with the victim. Surely the killer left something behind. Detectives used an alternative light source to search for hair or fibers. Again, they found nothing. unless a substantial clue surfaced soon, there would be no way to catch this killer. As investigators finished their search of the crime scene, they realized that they were being watched. After leaving the police station, Helm had returned to the scene of the crime. He pulled a lawn chair out of his car and set up an observation post on the neighbor's lawn. Peculiar behavior for someone who just lost his spouse.
That type of interest is usually to spectators who don't know these people, and normally the family is somewhere else consoling one another.
You never touched your wife. You went directly.
Helm's detached interest in the case fueled detective suspicions.
Never touched your wife. No.
They asked him to come to the station for another interview.
But you want to know why?
After almost 2 hours of questioning, police obtained enough information to get a warrant to collect samples of his hair, saliva, blood, and handprints.
Okay, pull it up.
In order to prove that Helm had killed his wife, police would have to find evidence that he was the one who moved the body.
To me here.
If Trotter's team could find Helm's fingerprints on a portion of the victim's skin that had been beneath the blanket, they'd be able to test his story. But they faced a big obstacle. In the field, no one had ever successfully lifted finger or palm prints from a body before. Des Moines police had tried and failed 6 times before. At a crime scene, it is difficult to control the variables required for success. Proper timing, temperature, and humidity were crucial. The experimental technique to raise fingerprints from skin had only succeeded in laboratories. If they could make it work at a real crime scene, it would bring criminal investigation to a whole new level of precision. The technique relies upon superglue's ability to turn the human touch into a permanent imprint. Years ago, workers at a superglue factory noticed that if they weren't careful, they left their fingerprints on the glue packaging. And because of their exposure to the glue fumes, these fingerprints couldn't be wiped off. Vaporized superglue, or cyanoacrylate ester, adheres to the oil deposited by the human touch. It attaches to fingerprints on hard substances such as glass or metal, creating a thin shell over the ridged pattern. It actually seals the print under a layer of plastic. In most cases, this pattern can then be dusted and lifted with tape. But lifting a delicate print off a textured, oily surface like skin is a tricky procedure. If there were any prints on Susan Helm's body, they wouldn't survive a trip to the coroner's office. The slightest change in temperature or the lightest brush against the body could ruin them. The testing would have to be done where the body lay.
All we could see was maybe just
In the lab, the technique had succeeded only on prints less than 4 hours old. Susan Helm had been dead for more than 12 hours. But it was the only hope police had of tying the murderer to the crime. The first step was to build a tent around the victim. A plastic drop cloth was wrapped around the frame and secured. Temperature within the tent must be increased to speed the evaporation of the glue. In the field, it's difficult to control. Liquid superglue was placed in aluminum dishes and set on burners inside the tent. The glue was heated for 10 minutes until fumes filled the structure. Technicians allowed 30 minutes for the glue to set. After the fumes settled, technicians moved in. Whatever lay beneath the plastic would make or break the case. If they could find a good quality print, they might be able to catch a killer. But if history were any guide, they'd find only a degraded print or none at all. And that meant a killer would walk. The plastic was peeled back from the body. Technicians searched for the ridges of a human fingerprint with a halogen flashlight. Shining the light at an angle helps the prints stand out. Passing over the lower portion of the victim's abdomen, the light revealed a pattern. It wasn't a fingerprint. It was larger and more distinct than they could have imagined. The print from practically an entire hand. The potential proof was there for the investigators to see. But success still seemed just beyond their grasp. For the first time in forensic history, scientists had been able to coax a latent print from a human body outside of the laboratory. But collecting the print would be another matter. Lifting it with tape would likely destroy it. Scientists needed to lift the print photographically. The photographed print from the victim's belly was delivered to the Des Moines Police Department Crime Lab, where it was compared to the print taken from William Helm. When comparing two fingerprints, identification technicians use a computer to look for matching patterns. Because palm prints are so intricate, technician Jerry Wilson had to make the comparison manually. The time-consuming task requires him to pinpoint areas where ridges join, diverge, or form dots.
The ridge on the outside.
Using those patterns as reference points, Wilson compares the prints for similarities.
And we look for these same identical points in the same relative unit space in each between the latent and the ink print, and the same amount of intervening ridges. And we also look for discrepancies, because if there's unexplained discrepancies, then you have to either eliminate the print altogether or explain why there is a discrepancy.
Technicians found no such discrepancies between the prints. Instead, they identified a highly unusual formation on both.
There was a double loop formation in the palm print, which is very unusual.
Go ahead, zoom in
And that helped to locate the pattern area and made the comparison much easier between the inked and the latent print.
Right here we've got an upward ending ridge.
Wilson can call two prints a match if they share 8 common reference
Ending ridge
points.
right there.
In the Helm case, technicians stopped counting
This
at
is kind of
90.
up in the interdigital area, so we got two delta
It was one of the most
formations.
obvious matches their office had ever come across.
There.
The discovery of William Helm's palm print on his dead wife's belly proved he was lying. He was the one who placed her into bed. It seemed police had caught the killer with a drop of glue. But to make a conviction stick, they needed to connect him directly to the murderous act. The victim wasn't strangled with bare hands. The killer had used a length of wire. Police had enough evidence to obtain a search warrant for Helm's apartment. There, they found the final piece of the puzzle. The garrote, a piano wire stretched between 2 wooden handles, has only one purpose: strangulation. Though tests in the lab showed no trace evidence on the wire, its gauge was consistent with the marks on the victim's neck. Trotter pieced together a likely scenario of the murder. On the morning she was killed, Susan and William Helm had argued for the last time. William became enraged and took her life. He tried to cover his deed with a blanket, But the persistence and methodical attention to detail of the Des Moines Police Department produced the clue that marked him as a killer. William Helm was convicted of first-degree murder in the strangling death of his wife. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole.
The forensic evidence in this case was extremely important because of the lack of witnesses and blood and all those other kinds of things that you can typically use to prove your case. So the fingerprint, or the palm print in this case, was the turning point for us.
By making sense of obscure prints, forensic scientists helped expose the crimes of Richard Ramirez and William Helm. Thanks to advances in technology, murderers like them can no longer escape the lasting impressions they leave behind.